Everybody, thank you so much for coming. My name is Hilal. Before we begin, I just wanted to let everyone know that I do have a stutter. So if there's like anything you need me to repeat, please don't hesitate to let me know. I'm a sophomore studying human biology, and I'm the Abbasi-Markaz fellow for this year. A little bit about the fellowship. It was established in 2020 as a collaboration between the Abbasi program in the Islamic studies and the Markaz Resource Center. The purpose of the fellowship is to foster student-led campus conversations on themes related to Islam or to Muslim societies and cultures in like any historical or regional context. We have one event per quarter, so be sure to look out for our spring quarter event in the future. For our second guest this year, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Asma Sayeed. Professor Sayeed is an associate professor and the program director of Islamic Studies at UCLA. She earned her PhD from the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. Her primary research interests are in early and classical Muslim social history, the history of Muslim education, the intersections of law and social history, and women and gender studies. Her 2013 book, Women and the Transmission of Religious Knowledge in Islam, analyzes Muslim women's religious education, specifically their transmission of hadith from the rise of Islam to the early Ottoman period. So throughout this event, I'll be facilitating the conversation by asking Professor Sayeed some questions. Afterwards, we'll dedicate some time to inviting questions from the audience. With that, from the comfort of wherever you are currently, please join me in welcoming Professor Sayeed. All right, so I feel like this event is one we found important to facilitate because we wanted to offer a space for students to both appreciate the nuanced past of female scholarship in Islam, and while also developing a view on Muslim women in contemporary scholarship. So I think that with that, we can get right into the questions. So for the first question, Professor, can you please give us an overview of women's participation in early and classical Islamic scholarship?
Yeah, actually, before I get right into it, I want to thank you, Aya, for inviting me and to the Abbasi program for allowing me to be a part of this wonderful program and engaging in student conversations, which I think are so important and fascinating for me in a variety of ways. As you pointed out, this book that I published was in 2013, and these opportunities to engage in conversation are very important for me as well, because it allows me to revisit some of what I've done and to see how the field has taken shape and trajectories from the time of the publication of the book. So I want to actually start by talking about where I was kind of when I was a little bit older than you, I should say. I had just finished undergrad, was starting grad school, and I heard a lecture on female scholars in Islam in early Muslim history. I thought, wow, I'd never heard of such a thing. And I tracked down a couple of women who lived in the Mamluk period, and they were hadith transmitters. I wanted to find out everything I could about them. And, I just assumed, for whatever reason, perhaps because I was just starting out in my study of history, was that, these Mamluk scholars and what I'd seen in the Mamluk period was how it had always been, from the rise of Islam all the way, at least until the Mamluk period. And, once I got in deeper into the material and started really looking at what the biographical dictionaries were saying, I started collecting sort of more, I don't want to call it quantitative data, but let's just say numbers, early in my research. What I realized is that there are really, really stark and interesting patterns in terms of women's participation in religious transmission across the 10 centuries that I ultimately looked at. And so just to sum up what I saw there, and we can get into this more later, when you look at the earliest decades of Islamic history, that is the companion generation, what you see is that there is significant participation on the part of female companions. I focused on the Sunni Hadith collections early on in my research, and in the major Hadith collections, you have anywhere from 12 to 20% of female companions who are narrating traditions. And then you would assume that, okay, well, female companions are doing it, they're going to hand this tradition down to future generations. That doesn't happen. I shouldn't say it doesn't happen at all, but it doesn't happen in quite the way we'd expect. So the number of female successors is far lower than the number of female companions. And then around, say, the first quarter of the 8th century, when you have the generations after the successors, and throughout the 9th century, they're just really a handful of women. So we go from 112 female companions who are recorded in the Sunni Hadith collections to a very, very small number, a handful. In the 10th century, there are no women at all in any of the Sunni Hadith, in the isnads of the Sunni Hadith collections. And so, you think, okay, wow, that was a sad and sudden death of women. But in the mid 10th century, there's an interesting reemergence of women in this arena. And it begins as what I call a trickle, just a few women who participate, who are mentioned in biographical dictionaries, and more in Eastern cities like Nishapur, Marv, Isfahan. And then, by about the 15th century, you have in an Egyptian biographical dictionary, a whole volume devoted to women who are participating in Hadith transmission. And that pattern of women's increased participation continues through the all the way up until the early Ottoman period, and then it declines again. So there's this real kind of what I call fluctuating fortunes of women in this domain of transmission of religious knowledge that I find fascinating.
Interesting. So when we're taking a look at these female scholars, what kind of fields were they primarily involved in? And in particular, I'm wondering about how socio-political orders and cultural norms at the time affected the fluctuations that you were speaking of.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So, I chose the topic of the title for my book very deliberately. It's called Women in the Transmission of Religious Knowledge in Islam. And I think sometimes people read that as women and religious scholarship, broadly speaking. And that's not what I ever intended to convey. When I'm talking about the transmission of religious knowledge, I'm talking very, very specifically about Hadith transmission. And that's the field that they seem to have been primarily involved in. And I couch it in that kind of very tentative language because of our sources. I mean, our sources really are, or the sources that I relied on primarily, are biographical dictionaries, which are very much devoted to documenting the field of hadith transmission and other religious sciences, broadly speaking, but I think primarily concerned with hadith transmission. And so women, as far as I can tell from the sources, were successful in the field of hadith transmission first and foremost. And then we have women who are known for their skills in the areas of Quranic reading, tafsir to a lesser extent, fiqh, that is derived law, not usul al-fiqh, Sufism, ascetic piety, and to a far lesser extent, women are acclaimed for their understanding of kalam, theology or philosophy. Your question about socio-political orders, it's a really interesting one. So in my book, I kind of track the ways in which the rise of what I call Sunni traditionalism, a predominantly Sunni, that is Shafi, Maliki, Hanbali type of order prevailed in Egypt and Syria. And that resulted in the kinds of investments architecturally and in terms of education that favored women's participation as hadith transmitters. So, for example, the Mamluk sultans might sponsor mass readings of hadith. And so those kinds of things certainly favored women's participation. I mean, I'm kind of like giving you a very, very general picture, of what happened. The details are much better documented in my book. But I think that it is fair to say that the rise of majority Sunni local governments was a development that favored women's hadith transmission over and above other fields.
Interesting. So I know that you mentioned earlier that you wrote your book a decade ago. So thinking about your research at the time and comparing it with our current contemporary times, how would you describe the state of female scholarship currently? Do you think that there's been a shift, a notable kind of change, and how do you think certain contexts like geography, technology, possible changes in how we view like academic authority, how has that all kind of affected that change?
Yeah. So, you sort of, you phrase this as like the state of scholarship, the state of female scholarship, and I'm going to just parse that out a little bit more. I'm going to talk about this in two terms. One is the state of publications on women and their religious authority, or let's say women and religious learning, which is different from the state of female scholarship today, let's say, like within the past 30 years. So in terms of the state of scholarship, what I've noticed is that this is not anything new since the publication of my book, but the interest in women's history in general, anything having to do with women, and specifically their authority or their lack thereof, whether you're talking about political authority or authority as scholars, et cetera, it tracks geopolitics, right? And that's not perhaps really, really surprising. It's just something that's interesting to note. So if we look at major publication databases, in say major research libraries, what we see is that there's a rise in the number of publications having to do with women and their religious authority or women and their religious learning that correlates with major world events. So you see a bump a few years, that is a rise, a few years after the Iranian Revolution. And then which in turn, I think spurred a rise of conservative Muslim social movements. And so there's a bump there. The establishment of the Taliban in 1996 in Afghanistan, that also correlates with a rising interest in women and their Muslim women and their religious learning. The invasion of Afghanistan, for obvious reasons, and ones that Layla Abu Lughad has talked about in her book, Do Muslim Women Really Need Saving? So there are these kinds of ebbs and flows. In terms of the interest in Muslim women and their religious authority or their religious scholarship. And again, like I said, it's not surprising at all, but it's regrettable to me because I think that the topic of women and their religious authority, women and their religious learning and scholarship is one that has an independent interest value, let's say. It's just interesting on its own. And we shouldn't need sort of a crisis to kind of spur research, but I guess that's the state of the world today. In terms, a little bit more about the scholarship, and the reason that I'm going into this is because I really hope that some of the people who are listening are interested in this material and are thinking about, sort of what are the productive avenues of research and how can I learn more. So what we see in the pre-modern period, right, is that if you look at the historical sources, let's say the primary sources, we see women's religious learning as being defined primarily with respect to the Islamic sciences and with respect to hadith, right? So like I said, women were first and foremost hadith scholars according to the sources. When you get to the early modern and modern period, there is what I would call an expansion of this, how you define what the spaces of religious authority are. So you see more sort of like women who were known for their poetry, or women who might have been known for their knowledge of the Quran, or Islamic law, even, to a lesser extent, like I said, theology, philosophy, et cetera. Those areas, they start to be investigated within this space of women and their religious authority, women and their religious learning. And then, like again, in the modern period, within the past few decades, it's not just historians who've been interested in this, sociologists and anthropologists have as well. And so they have been very interested in what they're calling sort of traditional forms of religious authority in maybe rural communities, and the ways in which women might acquire religious authority in those communities. My point here is the ways in which religious authority is defined and studied have changed dramatically in the past few decades. And then you asked me, I think, about how different kinds of contexts might have changed how people think about women's religious authority, or the state of women's scholarship, I think you said, right? And so, so there are some really interesting things going on here, and I'll just touch on a few highlights, and maybe we can come back to this question in the Q&A. I think that there has definitely been what we might call a globalization of the interests in women's scholarship. Digital media and the internet has enabled sort of those who might establish these groups. And here I'm talking about groups like the Qubaysiyat, which are very much, I think, devoted to women's religious learning in very specific contexts. There's also Farhat Hashmi's group, Al Huda Institute, which, Farhat Hashmi is a Canadian Pakistani. Those are very much now international movements, right? They're well established in majority Muslim contexts, as well as in ones in which Muslims are minorities. And they have very, very large followings of women. So, social media, digital media have enabled this kind of internationalization and globalization of women's learning. However, there are really interesting questions about women's authority that arise, right? And so I think you also asked me about the ways in which women establish their credibility. So, I mean, I'm not answering the question. I'm going to do the classic academic thing and ask you a bunch of questions, or ask the audience a bunch of questions, spinning off that one, right? Which I think provide us food for thought. So does a woman who has a PhD in Islamic studies from a Western university, for example, I mean, I am a prime example of that, right? Does she have the same sort of authority as a woman who has gone through a course of education with Al-Huda? And, you know, if not, obviously the question is usually no. I mean, the answer is usually no. In what spaces do different women establish these different types of authority? You know, I think that whereas I may be authoritative in certain contexts, I'm definitely not authoritative in others. And how is that linked to my learning, my degree, my intentions for learning? And another really interesting question, I think, is the ways in which institutional contexts promote certain types of authority, uphold certain types of authority over and above other types of authority. So, I mean, the most obvious example of that is that, you know, if you want to get a job as an academic in a US university, you can only do it with a PhD. Does that mean that your learning is somehow better than, or you know, more comprehensive than someone who has learned in an informal context or a formal context, but not a PhD granting institution? You know, what do these forms of authorization, that is by, say, Western institutions, do? You know, what is their role and function in terms of sanctioning certain types of religious authority? So again, I don't have neat answers to those questions, but I think they're interesting questions for us to pursue.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I'm looking forward to seeing the questions from the audience that may arise from those kinds of prompts. So I also wanted to ask, particularly in reference to your mentions of our institutions affecting this type of topic, what does the future look like for Muslim women's religious learning, scholarship, their religious authority? What do you kind of see happening moving forward?
Yeah, so, you know, I think overall it's very fair and easy to say that if you are invested in more women learning more things, the future is a positive one. You know, it's clear to me that with digital media and the also increased access for women, and not just like, I don't mean here in the West, but all over the Muslim world. I mean, I think that Muslim women are either being encouraged by state policies and incentives to enroll in religious institutions, and or they have their own will and desire to learn. So there is a marked uptick in the numbers of women who are interested in religious learning. So that to me is a positive thing, because it's more minds and hearts to engage with about this idea of women of religious learning. And I think that this is not, you know, it's important to keep in mind that this is not just Sunni women. You know, Shia women, Sunni women of all madhahib, Shia women of the various madhahib, as well as, you know, those who may not associate with specifically with Sunni or Shia. There really is a rising interest in religious learning among Muslim women, but I think amongst other women of other faith traditions as well. You know, so that's the positive. the more mixed picture, I think, comes in when we look at the ways in which Muslim women's religious learning, the scholarship that Muslim women might produce, or the scholarship about Muslim women that's produced by men or women, the ways in which all of this intersects with current polemics that sometimes have absolutely nothing to do with women themselves, but in a stand-in for other kinds of conflicts. So one of the examples that comes to my mind is, and I was just speaking about this before this panel, but there was, a few years ago, there was what I call a Twitter mini battle about the status of Fatima al-Fihriya, who for a long time has been praised, or she's kind of noted for being the first Muslim, or being a Muslim woman who established the first university. And this is Al-Qarawiyyin in Fez. And there is, the Twitter battle that ensued about this. Somebody said, what's this business about Fatima al-Fihriya establishing Qarawiyyin? I think it's a proxy battleground for different kinds of ideological contestations between Muslims and non-Muslims, between academics of different stripes. So, I just looked this up before this panel because I should refresh my mind. And, some of the kind of what I would say are obnoxious sorts of tweets that were put out there is, somebody wrote in, little known fact, Fatima al-Fihri also founded a space exploration program and was the first woman and Muslim to walk on the moon. So, obviously, that is a takedown of not just Fatima al-Fihriya, but also of this whole idea that Muslim women were engaged in the enterprise of religious learning, that they did have this kind of exemplary role to play. And someone else, there was, again, like I said, an exchange on this, and someone else made the point or asked the question about where the quote unquote myth started. Someone responded that it started in the 1970s when Muslims in the Western world felt the heat over the underdeveloped Muslim world. It was at the same time that the myth about educated and powerful Muslim women and uneducated, powerless Western women in history began. So, it would be interesting to track really when the interest in Fatima al-Fihriya started, the ways in which she is noted or not noted in the Muslim sources. Did it actually begin in the 1970s? What can it tell us about the polemics around and the symbolism around Muslim women's scholarship and religious learning? So, I think that even as Muslim women strive to educate themselves about their religion and acquire more authority in this space, their participation is going to continue to be entangled in these kinds of polemics. And there's one other interesting thing for me, something that I think about when we think about authority and authoritativeness of Muslim women who are learning, right? Is the ways in which certain kinds of normative standards might be enforced, or the ways in which, let's say, women's religious authority becomes a space for policing and establishing sort of who is a good Muslim woman, right? And what I'm talking about here are, and I'm asking this very genuinely. I'm not asking it sort of in a rhetorical way, right? So there are organizations that focus primarily on teaching Muslim women about sort of, say, the 5 pillars, the proper practice of the 5 pillars, about ritual piety, that focus on kind of just communicating information about personal law and, legal status questions like marriage, inheritance, divorce, like what we might say are, sort of really gender domains of legal discourse. According to the 4 madhahib, I mean, they'll teach women what the Sunnis, what all the Sunnis and the Shias have to say about questions in these areas. But they won't teach them anything else, right? And so what is the intent of these organizations? I mean, is it to generate and legitimize certain models of feminine piety and learning, to legitimize certain understandings of gender roles? And do those things ultimately limit the range of women's actions? Or are they actually intended to create sort of old new, let's say hyphenated, old new models or exemplars of feminine or women's action that can thrive in our contemporary age with all of its challenges, et cetera, and still be rooted in a scriptural tradition or a legal tradition that has that makes sense. So I think that, and that makes sense. They can be legitimized, right? And that gives them a sense of authenticity and power through that authenticity. So it really is, like, as I say, a mixed bag. I mean, I think overall the picture is a really positive one, but it is going to become, I think, increasingly polemical for a number of reasons. So I'll stop there. I mean, there's more I can say about that, but I will, as I said, stop there.
Got it. So I know that there's a lot of different people joining us for this event today. So kind of outside of the realm of specifically like Islamic scholarship, I wanted to ask if you had any like insight into what recent developments there may have been involving women generally in their scholarly authority.
And thank you for that question. I think it's because it allows us to connect to the topics of what we're talking about to other debates and discourses in academia in general about women's authority, about the ways in which women's spaces are created in the academic world. And I think that, there isn't much that is unique, unfortunately or fortunately, about the challenges that women experience in terms of establishing their religious authority in majority Muslim contexts or in Muslim communities. Overall, even as the picture is improving and there are more and more women who are being recognized as being authoritative, not just in the religious sciences, but in other fields, in the humanities and social sciences, I think that the battle to kind of recognize women's authority as legitimate, as equal to male authority, is really an uphill one. So, there's an excellent article by Keisha Ali that was, I think, relatively recently published in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, and I'm blanking on the title, but it has to do with the ways in which the business of citation and how women's publications appear, the patterns of citation for women versus men in leading publications in the field of religion, and the ways in which, those patterns show a marginalization of women as authoritative figures. I think that this is, something that we see amongst Muslim circles, in non-Muslim circles, whether we're talking about Muslim women's authority in terms of Islamic learning, or where we're talking about anthropologists or sociologists, et cetera. They're really, women struggle to establish their authority in the same ways that men have authority or claim authority. And I think, I don't know if, can you all still hear me or see me? I think there's something wrong with the.
I think that might have been an internet stability issue on my end, but I think I'm good.
Okay. All right, good. So you can still hear me then. So yeah, I mean, I think that it will serve those who are looking at questions of Muslim women's authority to keep an eye on fields outside of Islamic studies to see how these same questions occur in Jewish women's women's studies in Judaism and Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, as well as completely secular domains as well, because they map really well onto other spaces.
Got it. Sounds good. It's good to hear about connections and potential connections there. Okay, so I think that we'll give a minute or two for people from the audience to send in questions. There should be a feature to type out and send in a question to the webinar. So if there's anything you want to hear insight on, please send it through. I don't think we'll have time to get through all of the questions, but we appreciate people's engagement regardless. Thank you so much. So yeah, we'll just give it a minute or two.
Sure. And just to confirm, are you going to let me know which questions to address?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. I just, I'm really technologically not very savvy. I just figured out how to access the question, so.
All right, I think that we have a question about Hadith scholarship generally. I think people are interested to know how Hadith scholarship has changed in the last 10 years, and also specifically if the number of female narrators being lower than their male counterparts is something we can kind of connect to post-colonial history potentially, or that they weren't fully taken into account because of a socio-political order like the patriarchy, or if it's something that is due to another factor.
Yeah, so the first, actually, let me just write down some of these questions. With respect to the number of women being less than men, right, and how we can understand that, that's how I'm taking your question. It is not a post-colonial phenomenon by any means, and this is actually one of the things that I was trying to bring out in my book, and I really do encourage those of you who are interested to look at that, because what I try to show in very clear terms is that we, just as we cannot attribute sort of the rise of women, the numbers of women in the Mamluk period as hadith transmitters to some kind of a proto-feminism, we can't kind of attribute the marginalization of women at least solely to colonial or post-colonial factors. I mean, for me, what I've noticed is that what I think I've teased out from the sources is there are things like, what I call the professionalization of hadith learning, which, and this is in the 2nd century, which established certain standards for people to participate in hadith. And one of those standards was you've got to go learn the hadith directly from the teacher. And when we're talking about pre-modern Islam, 7th century, 8th century, we're talking about these really long, arduous journeys, across tremendous geographies and landscapes. They're really hard for women to do, and go get the certification with direct contact. And so that with a male scholar. So even if we sort of remove the barrier that interaction between men and women was not open and was not as permissible as it is today, just the hard fact of it's really hard to travel alone as a woman across this terrain limited women's access to or their ability to acquire this kind of education and get the professional credentials. So professionalization of hadith initially was a factor that limited women's participation. And then, you know, I say oddly enough, it is the rise of canonical collections or the canonization movement, which ultimately, in my analysis, from my perspective, led to women being able to re-enter the domain in very large numbers. Because once you establish, okay, here, that and the increased use of paper. Because once you have established that these are the Sahih Hadith, these are the canonical ones, here are the most important collections, and you have a situation in which women can read books, right? I mean, there's written material being circulated, not just books, and women can learn those on their own. They have the opportunity and the space to re-enter the domain of hadith transmission. So there are factors outside of colonialism and post-colonial orders that I think can help to explain these fluctuating patterns of women's transmission. And you had asked me another question and I blanked on it. Could you?
Yeah, it's all right. So somebody asked, how has hadith scholarship generally changed in the last 10 years?
Oh, right. Okay. So, you know, it's a good question. Unfortunately, I have not studied the modern period in terms of women's hadith transmission. So my answer is very, very anecdotal, but my sense is that women are continuing to be very active in spaces where memorization of just even small collections or portions of, say, the Sahihs of Bukhari and Muslim is highly encouraged, right? And so there is this continuing focus on memory and virtuosity in this respect, that you memorize some of these hadith collections, that you become a respected authority. Now, I know that tradition still exists in pockets in Morocco where I do my research, and I imagine in other spaces in the Muslim world. And then alongside that, there is an increased interest in women engaging analytically and critically with the hadith corpus. And so here questions of authority arise again, right? So we are seeing some of this like kind of interest in dating hadith, like so trying to figure out, you know, which of these hadith are authentic, how many of them actually date back to the Prophet, et cetera, in amongst women who are more educated in, or who have gotten their degrees in Western universities. And so there is this, you know, interest in critical analysis of the hadith corpus, understanding, you know, how much of it is authentic and what can it tell us about the early Islamic past and social history. And then there's also a real interest in, I think, again, one that didn't exist before, wasn't possible before, in critically analyzing hadith to come up with different understandings of Islamic law in the areas of marriage, divorce, inheritance, political authority, et cetera. So for me, all that, it's not just within the past 10 years, but let's say 5 to 6 decades, there's a lot more of that type of work going on.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. I think a really good question that we got as well was, how did Muslim men engage with Muslim women as scholars, especially in the pre-modern era? Were there biases that were relevant against them or for them? And do we kind of see this change over time?
Yeah, so, you know, interestingly, in the biographical dictionaries, which were, you know, the major source that I consulted, you don't find men criticizing women sort of in gendered ways with respect to their religious learning. I mean, whereas you might find men saying, okay, I mean, male scholars who compiled these dictionaries saying, okay, X, Y, or Z were not reliable for some reason, or they were known for, just making up stuff. You don't find that really in the entries on women. And I think that, one of the classical Muslim scholars at Zahabi commented on this as well, that women were not really criticized for being sort of faulty in their discernment or have poor skills as far as hadith transmission is concerned. However, that is not the same thing as saying that women weren't marginalized in these spaces, either because of sociocultural factors. I mean, they were just not given the opportunities to learn alongside men, or that when women tried, they weren't pushed back or pushed away. It's just that we don't have the same kind of record of those. And we do know, I mean, there are plenty of studies on this in the pre-modern, and from looking at pre-modern literature, that there are genres of adab literature that talk about what is appropriate for men as opposed to women, and talk about the ways in which women might be deficient. I mean, many of us are familiar with that report about women being deficient in intellect and religion. And so expounding on that idea that women are deficient in these ways. But what's interesting is that that's a separate genre, right? That's a separate genre of adab literature. And so the literature on biographical collections don't reflect this bias against women. Now, is that just a genre consideration, or does that speak to the differences between the fields of hadith transmission and some other fields? I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question to think about.
Another question. So what are your predictions for the areas of scholarship that Muslim women may participate in the future? Which areas do you anticipate might rise in popularity?
Are you talking here specifically about the religious sciences? I mean, in here, I mean Sharia, Quran, Hadith, or are you just talking about generally like learning?
I assume that the person's speaking specifically about the religious sciences.
Okay. So, just instinctively, I want to say law. I want to say that, women, and then followed by Quranic interpretation, but in very like sort of specific, specifically gendered questions, like about women's status, et cetera. And the reason I want to say law is that whether you look at kind of Western universities and the ways in which, women are focusing, and here I'm speaking very, very specifically about, and again, it's totally anecdotal, about Muslim women and what they are focusing on in terms of their interest in the Islamic sciences, very, very specifically. There seems to be, more of an interest in legal questions, derived law, like fiqh. The fiqh of marriage, divorce, inheritance, followed by an interest in usul and the methodology of deriving these rules, and then an interest in Quranic interpretation, and generally Quranic interpretation specifically having to do with issues related to women. Again, this is really, really anecdotal. I would have to kind of look at some survey of dissertations produced in the past 20 years or 30 years to be able to say whether my anecdotal sense is correct or not. I mean, the picture really changes if you expand the scope to include, fields like history, anthropology, sociology, which we're not talking about at all here. I mean, we're really just talking about, women who are taking up, Islamic studies in terms of Islamic law, Quran, Hadith, philology, like Arabic language and grammar and stuff like that. I see more of an interest in law.
Interesting. Okay, so for this next question, do you feel like the culture of Arab countries supports and promotes women's leadership? Are you familiar with, any political orders in the Arab countries specifically that we can kind of see affecting a shift?
That's a loaded and tough question. In part because, of course, we can't really talk about Arab countries in such broad brushstrokes, right? There is a world of a difference between, what might be happening in some of the Gulf countries and, say, the North African countries. Let me speak specifically about Morocco, because that's where I'm doing my research, and it's on contemporary Muslim women's education. So some of you may have heard of the Murshidat, this is, these are women who are specifically trained in Islamic law and Quran to a certain extent, and Hadith. This is a government endorsed and supported program to train a group of Muslim women who can serve as legal authorities on a whole host of questions. So when this Murshidat program was first established in the early 2000s, there was a lot of excitement in the Western media in particular, like, oh, the Moroccan government is, supporting women's religious authority. And then a number of Moroccan women, as well as, Western scholars looking onto this, started critiquing it. And they said, this is just basically a reproduction of very traditional gendered forms of authority. Right. And what the Moroccan government is doing is allowing a space for women's action that's still tightly controlled and where there is a very clear glass ceiling. Like, women are not really going to become authoritative in the spaces of producing Islamic legal knowledge, because producing knowledge and that creative act is the ultimate act of authority, right? And the exercise of authority. And so, again, I believe from what I've seen in my research and my conversations in Morocco, that the field has expanded in very significant ways for Muslim women as far as religious learning is concerned, and their authority is being established in meaningful and really fascinating ways. Is that equal to the authority that men are given, or that they have access to? No. Is it a false comfort and just placating and ultimately just there to promote a government agenda? Perhaps. But if in the end it results in sort of 10 or more women being religiously authoritative in ways they weren't before this government reform, I'll take it. I just my bar is perhaps not that high, but yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so I think that's about all the time that we have for today. So before we all leave the webinar, I wanted to take some time to acknowledge the people that made this event possible. I'd like to thank Professor Sayeed, firstly, for offering her time, her insight, her expertise, for an amazing conversation. I know that I found it really illuminating, and I'll be taking a look back at the recording for sure to kind of delve deeper into a lot of these points. I additionally want to thank my advisors, Dr. Farah Sharif and Dr. Abia Ahmed, as well as Rura Khalid, for making this webinar possible. Thank you to all of the attendees for coming. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Thank you so much, Aya. This was a wonderful conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. And you've given me a lot to think about. And thanks to those of you who attended and took time out of their, whatever we are, Thursday afternoon to join us. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.